The desert wind carried with it the dry taste of dust and silence. It's a kind of silence that presses down heavy on a man's shoulders. Out here, miles away from any sign of town or trail, only the sun and the sand kept witness to the broken. A woman sat hunched against a boulder, her dress torn, skin marked with scratches and bruises that told stories she didn't need to speak aloud. Her breath came sharp, uneven, like every inhale was a battle she wasn't sure she could win. When she looked up, her eyes met the shadow that loomed over her. A figure carved of muscle and scar. The kind of man who didn't belong to towns or law, but to the mountains themselves. The mountain man had wandered down from the high ridges where he'd lived more wolf than human for years. His shoulders were broad as tree trunks. His back scored with old wounds that spoke of fights against man, beast, and everything in between. Folks whispered about him and the scattered saloons called him dangerous. Untamed, a creature of the wild who had little use for people. Yet, when his gaze fell on her, something shifted in him. She didn't look like she belonged in this wasteland. She looked like a soul who had already been dragged through hellfire and left to crawl. Her lips parted, the words leaving her throat raw, almost pleading, but steady enough to sting. "Just do it quick," she said. Not a cry, not a beg, just a command born out of surrender. She thought he'd strike her down, thought maybe death would be kinder than whatever she had run from. But instead of lifting his hand, he crouched, eyes narrowing as if reading every scar that ran along her arms and legs, as if each mark was a map leading him straight to the devils who had made them. His chest rose with a low sound, half growl, half oath. The desert around them seemed to lean in, listening, holding its breath. "I'll hunt all of them down," he rumbled, voice deep as thunder rolling through canyon walls. She blinked, stunned, as if she hadn't heard right. Out here, no one ever promised to help. No one cared. Strangers passed suffering the way they passed cactus and stone with indifference. Yet this man, who had no name to her, no reason to stay, had just bound himself to her scars like a chain. The wind kicked up again, dragging the sand in swirling ribbons, and for a moment it seemed the world itself knew something had shifted. This was no longer just an escape, no longer just a chance encounter. This was a storm waiting to break. He studied her like a hunter studies tracks, trying to see the story behind her silence. She tried to look away, but his eyes held her, steady and sharp, like he'd already chosen to carry her burden on his shoulders. There was no softness in him, no gentle words, just that growl that promised vengeance, and a presence that felt as unshakable as the mountain ridges he had walked down from. She swallowed, her throat dry as sandpaper. "You don't even know who they are," she whispered, voice trembling with both fear and disbelief. He straightened, the sun casting his figure in fire and shadow. "Don't matter," he said flatly. "Scars tell enough." The way he said it made her heart jolt. Like every cut, every bruise had already sentenced her tormentors. Like he needed no names, no details, only the sight of her pain. For the first time in years, a flicker of hope sparked in her chest, though she tried to crush it down. Men had promised things before. Promises broke like glass out here. But this man wasn't making a promise the way others did. He was declaring a hunt. And once a mountain man declared a hunt, nothing in the wild could stand in his way. The desert sun dipped lower, painting the horizon in bands of gold and red. The shadows grew longer, darker. She shivered, not from the chill, but from the thought of what lay ahead. If he truly meant to hunt them all down, blood would follow. She wasn't sure if that terrified her more, or gave her the first reason in years to breathe. His hand, rough as weathered bark, tightened on the strap of the pack slung across his shoulder. He gave her one last look, not soft, not tender, but firm with resolve. "Rest now," he said, voice cutting through the hush like a blade. "When you wake, we start." The desert night crept closer. Coyotes already howling in the distance, but the greater danger wasn't out there in the wild. It was in the men who had left her broken. And as she leaned her head back against the boulder, her heart hammered with the weight of his vow, she closed her eyes, hearing his words again, tasting the danger in them. He would hunt them all. But in a land where justice was bought and cruelty ruled unchecked, could even a mountain man stand against what waited in the shadows? Somewhere beyond the dunes, the horizon whispered of coming storms. And as darkness swallowed the desert whole, she knew this was only the beginning. Would his growl be enough to scare devils back into their holes? Or would his vow drag them both into a fight no one could walk away from? The answer hung heavy in the night, unresolved, trembling on the edge of dawn. The desert night was long and full of whispers. The woman lay with her back pressed to the boulder, every sound of the shifting sand making her flinch. Sleep did not come easy, though her body begged for it. The mountain man kept watch, standing as still as the rock itself, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. He did not need fire or a lantern to keep him company. His presence alone was enough to push back the darkness, enough to keep the wild at bay. Yet in the quiet between the winds, her mind kept turning back to the words he had spoken. He said he would hunt them down, every last one, as if the promise was carved into stone. She tried to steady her breath and wondered if he truly understood what he had taken upon himself. Men like those who had left her scarred were not just cruel. They were organized. They roamed in packs, hiding behind names and badges that gave them false power. She had seen it all, the way they carried themselves as if the world owed them every scrap of land, every frightened face. If he went after them, he would not be walking into a fair fight. He would be walking into a hornet's nest. But she could not bring herself to warn him. Not yet. The dawn broke with a sharp edge, the first streaks of light pulling back the veil of night. She sat up, her body aching, and found him already moving with the discipline of a man who did not need much rest. He tied a leather strap around his wrist, checked the knife at his side, and slung his pack once more. His silence was heavy, not careless, but purposeful, as though words wasted energy. She wondered what life had carved him into this shape. What losses had driven him into the mountains in the first place? As they started walking, the desert stretched endless around them, dunes rolling like waves of a dry ocean. She limped slightly, each step reminding her of the wounds on her legs, but he adjusted his pace without saying a word. Every so often he glanced at her, not in pity, but in calculation, as if measuring how much strength she had left. After hours of walking, the silence between them finally broke. His voice came low, gravelly, carrying the weight of stone. "Tell me what they did." Her chest tightened. The memories were chains she had never wanted to drag out again. But his tone left little room for lies or avoidance. She looked down at her hands, pale against the dust. "They came at night," she whispered. "Tore through the place like wolves. Took what they wanted. Left me with nothing but these marks to remember." She pulled at the torn sleeve of her dress, showing the scar that ran along her arm. "I thought if I just kept running, I could leave it behind. But out here, nothing stays behind." He listened, eyes hard as flint, his jaw tightening with each word. She could feel the heat of his anger, even though his expression did not shift much. When she finished, the silence that followed was more terrifying than any threat. Finally, he spoke again. "How many?" She hesitated, counting in her head the faces that still haunted her dreams. "6," she said softly. "Maybe more. I don't know if they all stayed together, but 6 for sure." His brow furrowed and a dark fire burned in his gaze. "Then 6 graves wait to be dug." Her breath caught at the certainty in his voice. He spoke not as though it was a task to be attempted, but as though it was already done. Still, she could not shake the fear that he underestimated them. She wanted to tell him how ruthless they were, how clever in the ways of cruelty. But something in his bearing stopped her. Perhaps it was the way he moved, sure-footed and calm, like a man who had faced worse odds before and lived to tell the tale. By midday, the sun blazed overhead, and they found shelter in the shade of a jagged rock formation. She leaned against the stone, her throat dry, her body weak. He dropped his pack, pulled out a canteen, and handed it to her without a word. She drank greedily, but when she tried to pass it back, he shook his head. "Finish it." She frowned, confused. "What about you?" "I'll find more," he replied simply, and she believed him. There was something about the way he said it. like water would bend to his will if he demanded it. As she rested, she studied him more closely. His back bore scars, long and jagged, some clearly made by claws, others by blades. They told of a life spent in constant battle, a life that had shaped him into something both human and beast. His hands, though rough and calloused, carried an unshakable steadiness. He was not the kind of man who lashed out without thought. Every action seemed measured, deliberate, guided by a code only he understood. She wondered why he had chosen to help her. Men like him did not tie themselves to strangers. They did not make promises to broken women in the desert. But when she thought back to the moment he had growled his vow, she realized it was not just for her. He had seen something in her scars that had awakened something buried deep within him. Maybe he was chasing his own ghosts through hers. As the day wore on, they pressed forward, heading toward the faint line of mountains that rose in the distance. Each step brought her closer to something she wasn't sure she wanted. Revenge was a dangerous path, one that could burn everything in its way. Yet she could not turn back, not with him leading her forward. That night, as they made camp beneath the cold gaze of the stars, she found herself asking the question that had haunted her since dawn. Why are you doing this? Her voice was small, almost swallowed by the wind. He looked at her across the fireless circle of stones, his eyes gleaming faintly in the starlight. For a long time he didn't answer, and she thought maybe he never would. But then his voice broke the night. Because men like that think the world's theirs to ruin. Somebody has to remind them it ain't. The words settled heavy in her chest. He wasn't saving her for her sake alone. He was answering a call older than either of them, a call carved into the bones of the land itself. The mountains, the rivers, the endless wild, they demanded balance. And when men tipped it toward cruelty, someone had to set it right. She lay back, staring up at the stars, her heart racing with equal parts fear and hope. The night stretched long again, filled with the sounds of the desert. Coyotes cried in the distance, and owls' wings cut through the still air. And somewhere far away, the faint echo of men's laughter drifted on the wind. Her body stiffened, and she turned her head sharply toward him. He had already heard it too. His hand rested on the knife at his side, his muscles tensed. The laughter was faint, carried by the desert, but it was enough. Enough to tell her they weren't alone. Enough to tell him the hunt was closer than either of them had expected. He didn't move yet, didn't speak, but his jaw clenched and his eyes narrowed into the dark horizon. The growl that had first shaken her rose low in his throat again, promising fire and blood. And she knew then that the storm he had promised was already on its way, rolling across the desert toward them, carrying with it the faces of men she thought she'd never have to see again. The laughter drifted across the desert night like a cruel echo from her past, and every hair on her arms rose. She pressed herself closer to the ground, her breath shallow, her pulse beating against her throat. He stood still as stone, every muscle tight, every line of his body drawn like a bowstring. For a moment, neither of them moved, listening, trying to measure the distance, the number. The intent carried in that sound. It wasn't the laughter of joy. It was the laughter of men who had never been told no. The kind of laughter that came after fire was lit and someone else was left in ashes. She clutched at her dress, her fingers twisting the fabric, and whispered, "It's them." The words slipped out without thought, heavy with certainty. He turned his head toward her, and though his face was calm, his eyes burned. There was no need to ask which them she meant. He already knew. The sound faded into the night, but the unease remained thick and pressing. He crouched low, running his fingers across the sand, testing its movement in the wind. "Southridge," he murmured, his voice so low she almost thought it was the earth itself speaking. "They're moving toward the canyon." His words weren't guesswork. He spoke like a man reading tracks in the dark, as if every shift of the air told him a story no one else could hear. Her heart twisted. The canyon was the only way forward if they kept their path. It was a place of narrow walls and sharp turns, a trap waiting to be sprung. If they followed, they would be walking into a funnel where the desert offered no mercy and no way out. She opened her mouth to protest, to plead that they avoid it, but before she could, he fixed his gaze on her. If we don't follow, we'll never find them again. The weight of that truth sank into her chest. This was the moment she had once dreamed of, the chance for justice. Yet it terrified her more than the thought of running forever. She could see the faces in her mind, the sneers, the boots, the way their shadows had filled her world. And now the mountain man was walking straight into their fire. At dawn, they broke camp with no fire, no words. He led, and she followed, her steps uncertain, her heart torn between fear and resolve. The desert sun rose higher, scorching their backs, but he moved with a relentless pace. Each time she faltered, he would slow just enough for her to catch up, then push forward again. She realized then that his determination was not only for her sake. It was for himself, for some old wound she could not yet see. By midday, they reached the canyon's edge. The land dipped suddenly, the cliffs rising like jagged teeth, shadows curling in the narrow passage below. The air was cooler here, but it carried a weight, as though the stones themselves remembered every drop of blood spilled between them. He crouched at the rim, scanning the path. She stayed back, clutching the rock as if it could keep her from falling into the same darkness that had once swallowed her whole. They camped here, he said finally, pointing at the ashes of a fire pit below. Not long ago, she peered down, and her stomach knotted. The marks were their prints in the dust, scraps of cloth, the broken bones of some unlucky creature roasted for their meal. The sight sent shivers crawling down her spine. She didn't need to see their faces to know it was them. As the mountain man studied the ground, she noticed something she hadn't before. His hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with fury held too long. His scars weren't just from wild beasts or mountain storms. They were from men who had crossed him in ways she could only guess. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if he hunted her demons because they were too much like his own. That night, they made no campfire. The canyon swallowed the moonlight, and the silence pressed close. She leaned against the cold stone, staring into the dark while he sat with his back to the wall, knife in hand, watching. Neither spoke of the laughter or of the tracks they followed, but both knew the path ahead would no longer allow silence much longer. When sleep finally took her, it was restless. She dreamed of boots crushing the earth, of cruel eyes and crueler hands, a fire burning her home to the ground. And then she saw him, the mountain man, standing in the flames, his growl shaking the sky, his blade dripping with shadows. She woke with a start, sweat on her brow, her heart racing. Across from her he was still there, eyes sharp, as if he had never closed them. Morning brought no comfort. The canyon narrowed, forcing them closer together, their steps echoing against the stone walls. She hated the sound, hated how it announced their presence. He noticed, too, his hand never leaving the knife at his side, his gaze flicking often to the ridges above. Every shadow became a threat, every loose rock a warning. It wasn't long before they found more signs. A torn strip of fabric caught on a thorn bush, empty bottles left scattered, carvings on the stone walls, mocking scratches that marked their path like wolves marking territory. Her stomach twisted as she recognized them. The men she had fled weren't just cruel. They were proud of it, leaving their marks for the world to see. By midday, the canyon opened into a basin where the air carried faint smoke and the smell of roasting meat. He stopped, holding up a hand. She froze behind him, her body trembling. They crouched low, peering over the rocks, and there it was at camp. Tents made from stolen cloth, fires burning, horses tethered nearby, and men. 6 of them, just as she remembered, laughing, shouting, drinking as if the desert itself bowed to their will. Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs rooted in place. He turned his head slightly toward her, his face unreadable, but his eyes steady. There was no fear in him, no hesitation. Just the silent question, was she ready for this? She couldn't answer. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her chest felt heavy, torn between the memory of her pain and the dread of what came next. Yet he did not press her. He only nodded once, as if he already knew what her answer would be in time. They pulled back into the shadows, retreating just far enough to remain unseen. He studied the camp from every angle, his mind working through paths, timing, weakness. She watched him, realizing that while she shook with fear, he was calm, methodical, as though every hunt had prepared him for this one. And in his calmness, she found a strange thread of strength, enough to keep her from collapsing. The sun dipped low, shadows stretching across the basin, and still they waited. She leaned against the rock, her mind racing with questions. What would he do? Would he strike tonight, or wait? Could one man stand against 6? And even if he did, what would become of her when it was done? Night fell, and the camp below grew louder. Their laughter echoed off the canyon walls, each burst of sound cutting into her like a blade. She clutched her knees to her chest, eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. Beside her, the mountain man watched, silent as ever. His presence as steady as the stone. The conflict pressed heavy between them, unsaid but undeniable. She wanted vengeance, but feared its cost. He wanted justice, but carried his own shadows. And below them, the men who had broken her still roared with the arrogance of those who believed they were. It's untouchable. The desert night thickened. Stars hidden by clouds, the air sharp with the promise of a storm. She could feel it coming, not just in the sky, but in the weight of his growl, the tension in his body. When it broke, it would not be clean. It would not be simple. It would be fire and fury, and there would be no turning back. And as she closed her eyes against the sound of their laughter, she knew the basin would soon be filled with something else entirely, the sound of the hunt he had promised. The storm he had carried down from the mountains, and the reckoning that had been waiting far too long. The canyon breathed with silence, except for the distant echoes of laughter rising from the basin below. Every shout, every burst of mocking voices scraped against her nerves.
Oh, yes.
Dragging her back to nights she had fought so hard to forget. She pressed her back against the cold rock, knees pulled tight, trying to quiet the tremor in her body. He crouched only a few feet away, unmoving, the way a predator waits at the edge of a field. Eyes fixed on prey that is yet to realize it's being stalked. The campfire light below flickered high, throwing shadows against the canyon walls. She dared a glance over the stone and saw them against 6 men gathered like kings of the desert, loud and careless, believing themselves untouchable. Their laughter carried arrogance, the kind that comes from too many victories, too much unchecked cruelty. She shivered and pulled back, unable to watch for long, but he stayed, studying every detail as if each movement mattered. Hours stretched thin. The air grew colder, yet sweat dampened her skin. He hadn't spoken since they found the camp, but his silence carried weight, sharper than any words. His patience unnerved her. She wanted to ask when, how, why, but she bit her tongue. Some part of her knew his mind was already set, his plan already weaving together like threads in a net. Finally, he shifted. Not much, just a slow turn of his head toward her. His face was hard, unreadable, but his eyes locked on hers. Tomorrow, he whispered, voice low as gravel sliding down stone. At dawn, her chest tightened. Dawn. One more night of waiting. One more night of hearing their voices echo through the canyon. Her fingers curled against the dirt, and she nodded, though her body screamed with unease. She had thought she wanted this, had dreamed of it in endless restless nights. Yet now, on the edge of it, she wasn't sure she could bear the weight. The night dragged slow. She barely slept, haunted by the sounds below, by memories of firelight and shadows. Each time her eyes closed, she saw faces leering, heard boots on wood, felt the sting of scars cut into her skin. She would jolt awake, heart racing, and there he was, always awake, always watching. The mountain man seemed untouched by exhaustion, his frame like carved stone against the darkness. When the first light crept over the rim of the canyon, he stood. His shadow stretched long, and for a moment he looked less like a man and more like some force drawn out of the earth itself. She pushed herself up, her body aching, her heart pounding. He glanced at her once, his gaze steady. "Stay behind me." The words were simple, but they carried finality. She wanted to argue, wanted to say she wasn't just baggage to be dragged along. But the truth lodged in her throat. She wasn't strong enough, not yet. All she could do was follow and hope his strength held for both of them. They moved down into the basin, their steps silent against the stone. The camp was quieter now. The fires burned low, their laughter stilled by drink. Only the occasional cough or muttered word carried in the dawn air. She stayed close, every muscle tensed, every sound magnified in her ears. The closer they drew, the harder it became to breathe. He stopped at the edge of the shadows, crouched low. From here, the camp lay in full view. Two of the men slept near the fire, sprawled carelessly, boots kicked aside. Another leaned against a rock, half awake, nursing a bottle. The rest were scattered, hidden by tents, or slumped on the ground. She gripped the rock at her side until her knuckles whitened, fear and rage twisting together inside her. He studied the camp, his eyes cold, calculating. Then, without looking back at her, he muttered, "This is where it begins." Her stomach dropped. She wanted to scream at him, to wait, to think, to remember that there were 6 of them, and only one of him. But the words froze in her throat. She could see it in his stance, hear it in the weight of his voice. There was no turning him back now. The first step he took into the open felt like thunder, though no sound followed. He moved like shadow, like a storm cloud creeping low. She stayed hidden, heart hammering, watching every motion. The man by the rock shifted, muttered something under his breath, then stilled again. For a moment it seemed the mountain man might pass unnoticed. But then one of the men stirred near the fire, his head lifting, eyes squinting into the growing dawn. She saw the recognition flare across his face, the sudden alertness. The jerk of his hand toward a weapon, her breath caught. The mountain man froze, his body coiled tight. For a heartbeat, silence ruled the camp. Then the man by the fire shouted, a harsh cry that tore through the morning stillness, waking the others. Chaos erupted. Men scrambled to their feet, grabbing for rifles, knives, whatever lay close at hand. The air filled with curses and shouts. She pressed against the rock, terror flooding her veins, every instinct screaming at her to run. But she couldn't move. She couldn't take her eyes off him. He didn't flinch, didn't panic. He moved forward with terrifying calm, his growl cutting through the din. The sound of it silenced her breath, rattled her bones. It was the sound of a man who had walked into too many battles to fear another. The men circled, shouting, weapons raised. She could see the sneers on their faces, the same cruel expressions etched in her memory. And she knew then this was the storm he had promised. The air itself seemed to tighten, waiting for the clash, for the fire to burst. She pressed her hand to her mouth, her body trembling as the circle closed around him. The dawn light painted the scene in red and gold, shadows stretching long across the ground. The men jeered, their confidence loud, their arrogance thick. 6 against 1, but he didn't waver. He stood tall, shoulders squared, scars shining like old battle lines across his skin. His knife gleamed faintly in the rising sun, his gaze steady as steel. He was outnumbered, outarmed. And yet he looked like the only man in the canyon who wasn't afraid. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. She wanted to scream for him to stop, to run, to survive. But her voice caught in her throat. She could only watch as the storm gathered in front of her, every second stretched thin. Every breath heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. The men shouted louder, their voices clashing against the canyon walls. Dust rose with their steps, the fire snapped in the wind, and the knife in his hand caught the light, and then the first man lunged. She didn't. See what followed clearly, only the blur of motion, the sharp cry, the clash of steel, and the growl that tore through the morning. The canyon roared with sound, and the world seemed to tilt, suspended on the edge of chaos. She clung to the rock, her nails digging deep, her eyes wide with terror and awe. The hunt had begun, and the storm was breaking. The basin shook with the violence of it. And all she could do was watch as the vow he had spoken rose like thunder, and the reckoning she had feared finally came to meet them both. The canyon was alive with the clash of steel, the snap of bone, and the ragged cries of men who had never before been hunted. Dust spiraled upward, mixing with the smoke of their fire, as the mountain man moved through them like a storm breaking loose from the ridges above. His growl shook the basin, not the sound of a man, but of something older, something carved by pain and loss. She clung to the rock, her breath caught in her throat. Watching the world twist into chaos, the first man had fallen quick, his arrogance cut short before it could turn into laughter. The others closed in, shouting, swinging blades and firing shots that echoed down the canyon walls. Each strike he delivered was deliberate, each movement fueled by fury that had been waiting for release. He did not fight with frenzy, but with purpose. As if every scar on her body demanded its own answer, she wanted to turn away, to close her eyes, but she couldn't. For years, she had carried the weight of their cruelty in silence, believing no one would ever stand against it. Now, before her eyes, that silence was broken. She trembled, not only in fear, but in something like release, though the night was still far from safe. One of the men spotted her in the shadows and shouted, his hand pointing straight at her. Her body froze. In an instant, the mountain man shifted, putting himself between her and the threat, his knife flashing as he drove the attacker back. She gasped, realizing his vow had never been hollow words. Every move he made was not just for justice. It was to shield her from ever being touched by that cruelty again. The fight stretched long, every heartbeat a hammer in her chest. When the dust finally began to settle, the basin lay still, except for the crackling of dying fire and the shallow breaths of the mountain man. He stood in the center, his chest heaving, his body painted with blood and sweat. Around him, the men who had once seemed larger than life lay scattered, stripped of their power, their laughter silenced. Her knees weakened, and she sank to the ground, tears spilling before she could stop them. She hadn't expected to cry. She had thought the day of reckoning would leave her only hardened, but the release was overwhelming. The scars on her body still burned, but for the first time, the weight of them seemed lighter. He turned toward her, his expression unreadable, his eyes shadowed with the toll of what had just passed. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he walked slowly to her side and crouched down, his presence still as commanding as when he had first appeared in the desert. "It's done," he said quietly, his voice heavy but steady. She shook her head, wiping at her face with trembling hands. "Nothing will ever undo what they did." His gaze softened, just barely. "No, but they can't do it again." The truth of those words settled deep inside her. She lifted her eyes to his, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe it. The world hadn't changed. The scars were still hers to carry. But those who had caused them no longer walked this earth, and that mattered more than she could put into words. The sun broke fully over the canyon, washing the basin in gold. The light revealed the exhaustion etched into his frame, the cuts that ran across his skin, the weight of his own battles. She realized then that this hunt had not been only for her. He had carried his own ghosts into the fight, and in destroying hers. He had struck against his own shadows too. They left the basin behind as the day grew hotter, walking in silence. She glanced back once, watching the canyon swallow the wreckage of the camp. It looked smaller now, as if the fear it once held had crumbled with the men who had ruled it. She turned forward again, her steps lighter than they had been in years. As they climbed toward higher ground, she found her voice. "Why did you really do it?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. His eyes were on the horizon, the ridges rising in the distance. Finally, he spoke. "Because no one ever did it for me." Her breath caught at the weight of those words. She didn't press further, but in that single answer, she understood more about him than he had shown in all their time together. He had known what it was to be left broken, to be abandoned in silence. And in her scars, he had seen the reflection of his own. They walked until the sun dipped low again, till the land turned cool and shadows stretched across the rocks. That night, they made a small fire for the first time, its glow soft against the dark. She sat across from him, watching the flames dance. And for the first time in years, she did not feel fear in the night. Her wounds still ached. But hope, fragile and new, sparked beneath her ribs. She knew she would never be who she was before. Pain had changed her, and nothing would erase that. But she also knew she no longer carried it alone. He sat quietly, staring into the fire, his scars catching the light. She wondered if he would leave when morning came, if his promise ended with the hunt. The thought of it twisted inside her. For so long, she had wanted only to be free, but now freedom carried a new shape. It was no longer about running. It was about finding a way to stand. She finally spoke, her voice low. "What happens now?" He looked at her, and though his face was still rough, his eyes held something softer than before. "Now you live," he said simply. The words settled over her like a blanket, heavy and warm. Live, not just survive, not just endure, but live. It felt like a foreign concept, one she wasn't sure she knew how to embrace. Yet for the first time, she believed she could try. As the night stretched on, she thought of the long road ahead, of healing, of building something new from the ashes of the old. It would not be easy. It would not be quick. But the storm had passed, and the silence left behind was not the silence of despair, but of possibility. When dawn came again, they packed their things in quiet rhythm. The desert stretched before them, endless and harsh, but no longer unbearable. She followed him up the ridge, her steps stronger now, her breath steadier. At the top she paused, looking back one last time at the basin far below. The memories would never fully fade, but they no longer owned her. She turned to face the horizon, the rising sun painting the sky in fire. The mountain man stood beside her, his frame tall against the light, his presence unyielding. He did not speak, and he didn't need to. His vow had been fulfilled, and in its wake, something unspoken lingered between them, not a promise. Not a chain, but an understanding together. They walked on, leaving behind the ghosts of the canyon, carrying only the scars that now marked survival rather than defeat. The desert wind swept over them, no longer carrying laughter, only the sound of a world that waited to be lived in again, and as they disappeared into the wild, she felt the truth settle inside her like a steady flame. Scars could not be erased, but they could be carried differently. And with every step she took beside him, she chose to carry them not as burdens, but as proof that she had endured, that she had risen, she had lived. The hunt was over, but the story was not an ending. It was a beginning written in the silence after the storm. A story of survival, of justice, and of the wild strength that comes when someone finally stands and says no more. And in that truth, she found her freedom.